right. Good afternoon to those joining us from the Stanford campus or elsewhere in California or on the west coast of the US. Good evening to those of us joining us from further east. Um, and good morning to those waking up in Taipei, Taiwan, or elsewhere in Asia. I am Karas Templeman. I am the program manager of the project on Taiwan in the Indo-Pacific region here at the Hoover Institution at Stanford University. And it is my pleasure today to introduce our speaker, Alex Wong of the Hudson Institute. I want to note today that this is the last of our regular speaker series events for the 2020-2021 academic year. I want to thank all of our audience for bearing with us as we dealt with the COVID-induced work from home and broadcast from home environment. And I hope you've enjoyed watching these from the comfort of your own home as much as we have enjoyed putting them on. This has allowed us to reach a larger audience, and we're grateful for the opportunity to speak with you in this format. I also want to note that the WHA, the World Health Assembly annual meeting is taking place this week, and Taiwan is once again not a participant in that annual meeting, as our speaker today will also talk about a bit. Taiwan until 2016 had observer status at that meeting, and so Taiwan has been excluded in part because of pressure from Beijing as part of a concerted political campaign to squeeze off Taiwan's international space. And that's particularly disheartening and relevant to today's conversation because Taiwan is also in the midst of a COVID outbreak, the worst there so far. They recorded just north of 400 cases today. And so while Taiwan has managed the COVID outbreak, a global pandemic, much better than just about any other country in the world, they're also facing a serious situation. And so I want to say a particular jiayo to our followers and our audience in Taiwan, and we hope that you're able to get the pandemic under control there very soon. I have strong confidence that you will. So without further ado, let me introduce our speaker today. It's my privilege to give you the background on Alex Wong, who is a senior fellow at the Hudson Institute. His research spans the US national security policy and foreign affairs, with a particular focus on US strategy in the Indo-Pacific region and the future of the Korean Peninsula. But he is also a commissioner on the US-China Economic and Security Review Commission, which is where I first met and interacted with Alex. That is a commission appointed by Congress to examine the national security implications of the trade and economic relationship with China. And he's serving a one-year term there. And that commission has met several times with him as part of it. I'd encourage you to check out the deliberations of that commission as well. They are online at the US-China Economic Commission website. Mr. Wong, prior to serving on that commission, was in the executive branch as a deputy special representative for North Korea and deputy assistant secretary for North Korea at the US Department of State. In that position, he was the #2 negotiator in denuclearization talks with North Korea, and he guided the US-led international pressure campaign against North Korea during the Trump administration. Previous to that, he was the leader of the State Department's efforts to implement the free and open Indo-Pacific strategy as the Deputy Assistant Secretary for Regional and Security Affairs in the State Department's East Asia Bureau. And in that role, he made a fairly high-profile visit to Taiwan in March of 2018, which may be how some of our audience is familiar with him. Prior to that, he also worked over on Capitol Hill, so he has broad experience in Washington. He was the foreign policy advisor and deputy general counsel to Senator Tom Cotton, and the Foreign and Legal Policy Director for the Romney and Ryan 2012 presidential campaign. He graduated summa cum laude from the University of Pennsylvania, and he received his JD with high honors from Harvard Law, where he was the managing editor of the Harvard Law Review and an editor of the Harvard International Law Journal. And the title of his talk today is Watch This Space, Beijing's Push to Close Off Taiwan's International Space and the US Response. Without further ado, Alex, the floor is yours.
Wonderful. Karis, thank you. And my thanks to you and your colleagues at the Hoover Institution for inviting me to share some thoughts today. As you said, I hang my hat at the Hudson Institute these days. And something I've noticed is how productive, how much productive collaboration there is between us here in DC at Hudson and you and your colleagues there at Hoover on the West Coast. So I'm glad to be part of that continued collaboration. The spectrum of topics concerning U.S. policy toward Taiwan is broad and multifaceted, but the topic we're discussing this evening, bolstering Taiwan's international space, is current and urgent. As you mentioned, Karis, in the backdrop of our conversation, the World Health Assembly is convening this week. This is the occasion for representatives from across the world to collect under the auspices of the World Health Organization to address the world's most pressing global health issues, COVID-19 chief among them, and set an agenda for action. But for the fifth year in a row, the WHO has excluded Taiwan from being an observer at this meeting. Now, this was not unexpected, but the decision of the WHO at the behest of Beijing puts into sharp relief the intensity of Beijing's broader effort to narrow Taiwan's international space, as well as the cost of that effort to the global community. Taiwan's significance on the global health stage is worth restating. First, Taiwan has a population of 24 million people, on par with that of Australia or all of the Nordic countries combined. This large population is not isolated. The people on Taiwan travel and host travelers frequently. Second, Taiwan has a world-class health system and a sophisticated public health apparatus that, even with the recent spike in COVID-19 cases, executed what may have been the best response to the pandemic that kept cases and deaths low while permitting the maintenance of economic resiliency. And last, Taiwan is a positive contributor to the global public health effort. Through both bilateral and multilateral means, the Taiwan authorities prioritize health assistance and technical training abroad. This includes steady aid to Taiwan's diplomatic partners, most of which are aid recipient countries with only limited health infrastructure. From a global health perspective, it makes no sense that Taiwan would be excluded from the WHO or from lower level meetings of the WHO where much of the technical work is done. Taiwan's exclusion, of course, harms the people on Taiwan as their interests are not being fully represented in the WHO. But of course, it harms the rest of the world that would benefit from Taiwan's expertise, its contributions, and coordination regarding health issues that we all understand recognize no borders. But I think it's important to note that Taiwan's exclusion from the WHO also harms the people in China. Years ago, during the time that China acquiesced to Taiwan's participation in the WHO, Chinese public health officials and cross-Strait officials would openly acknowledge that confidence-building measures with Taiwan in the public health arena made a lot of sense. Given the travel and economic exchange between Taiwan and the mainland, there was a shared threat of infectious diseases. But importantly, given the people-to-people connections and common language between the mainland and Taiwan, there was also an enhanced capability and possibility to coordinate on mitigating and eliminating the disease threat. For 5 years now, that threat has been allowed to fester. And it's worth asking what better steps might have been taken to combat and contain COVID-19 had that coordination continued and had it grown. Now, I've spent some time laying out the entire case of Taiwan in the WHO because it's emblematic of a broader Chinese effort in multilateral fora and the negative consequences globally of that effort. Over a period of years, China has deliberately gained increasing influence in technical intergovernmental organizations. That a country would seek greater influence at UN organizations and other fora is not in itself objectionable. but it has become clear that China has used its enhanced influence in significant part to pursue a range of narrow political aims. And it's done this at the expense of the technical missions of these organizations, namely to foster coordination and provision of international public goods. And perhaps the chief political aim that China has pursued in these fora is the isolation of Taiwan. A chief question we need to ask is, why would China do this? What are Beijing's objectives and intentions when it seeks to exclude Taiwan from international fora and, at other times, to encourage the diplomatic partners of Taiwan to switch their official recognition to Beijing? Of course, a portion of this answer is China's sensitivity to any international institution or foreign actor coming even near the question of China's claim of sovereignty over Taiwan. But that's not the entire explanation. For much of the past 40 years, there's been a discernible, if tenuous, line China has drawn where it would not protest Taiwan's inclusion in international fora where observer or non-state status was available. The basic idea was that if the participation of Taiwan did not touch on the question of sovereignty, China would stand down. This is the basis for Taiwan's participation in APEC, in the WTO after all, where Taiwan participates in a functional observer status. But China's objections in the case of the WHA for the past 5 years and the intensity of its protestations in other contexts do not turn on any recognition by an international body of Taiwan as an independent state. They're turning, in fact, upon other motivations. First, China is increasingly using its ability to pressure Taiwan's international space as a cudgel against Taiwan's democracy, and in particular, President Tsai Ing-wen. China's WHA protest, as well as its campaign to poach some of Taiwan's diplomatic partners, began 5 years ago with the election of President Tsai. Beijing explicitly linked the WHA decision in 2017 to its row with President Tsai over the status of the 1992 consensus. While the world has become perhaps acculturated to China's casual linkage of the question of Taiwan's sovereignty to the issue of WHA participation, it was in fact quite a bold and disturbing development. It was an open statement by China that it was using its position in a technical world body, one that should be free from politics, to achieve China's narrow political ends in a coercive manner. In this frame, the harm to the public health outcomes of the people on Taiwan and the rest of the international community wasn't an ancillary consequence of China's effort to exclude Taiwan. It appeared to be the point. The second motivation behind China's current push to isolate Taiwan is related to China's domestic party politics. There's been much talk in recent years, in both the media and in diplomatic circles, of so-called wolf warrior diplomacy. Diplomats who have been on the other end of this style of diplomacy are familiar with its hallmarks: nationalistic lectures and sometimes insults delivered in a brusque tone that seldom make any nod to any notion of dialogue or diplomatic exchange of ideas. The truth is that these are not, in fact, diplomatic dialogues, because when wolf warriors are talking, their audience isn't the foreign diplomat across the table. The audience is the domestic audience back at home in China, and in particular, the Chinese Communist Party authorities. With each passing year, the domestic party politics of China increases its demands on China's diplomats, on China's overall foreign policy, and I believe increasingly on its cross-Strait policy. Looking to the statements of Xi Jinping and other party leaders, it's clear that the issue of Taiwan is taking on a larger and more urgent profile in the party's planning. Whereas leaders prior to Xi Jinping laid out more restrained policies regarding Taiwan, they were that were at best or at base status quo positions. Xi Jinping has been different. He's expressed impatience with the Taiwan issue and a desire not to pass the question of Taiwan from, quote, generation to generation. While China is not a democracy, it is not bereft of popular and party politics. Xi's statements at the same time both fuel and reflect a nascent political desire among the Chinese population and the Communist Party members to force the issue across the strait. You could term this a negative political feedback loop, one to which China's wolf warrior diplomats are responding. And we're seeing part of that response in China's increasing pressure on Taiwan's international space. The third motivation behind the current push to isolate Taiwan is the most worrying to me, and it's where I think US interests are most at stake. In modern military studies, there is the concept of shaping the battle space. This is work done before the introduction of kinetic operations to frame the strategic parameters of the entire battle space, to best position your forces and place the adversary at a disadvantage. This goes beyond traditional battlefield factors to more abstract, but equally vital, political and economic factors. Judging from China's considerable increases in defense spending over the past decade, coupled with an evaluation of the types of air, sea lift, long-range fires, and information capabilities that it's investing in, I think it's clear that China is preparing its military for a possible Taiwan contingency. At the same time, I look at China's increasing efforts to isolate Taiwan in the same light. China is preparing the political battle space to enhance its chances at success in a coerced unification operation if it so chooses. China's success in an invasion scenario depends not just on military hardware, but also on the intensity of the international political opposition it would face. An isolated Taiwan is an easier target for a Chinese strategic planner. It's not so easy for a Chinese planner if Taiwan has strong ties to international institutions and both official and unofficial partnerships around the world. Invading a Taiwan that is strongly wedded to the international space would put China at greater risk of pulling in other actors into the conflict. Those actors may not play a direct military role, but they would respond with measures that would close off China's own international space in the political and economic arenas. Now, so far in my remarks, I've laid out what I see as China's multifaceted motivations in trying to close off Taiwan's international space. And in reviewing them, I think there's a clear trend. Beijing's approach to diplomatic matters, technical cooperation matters, political matters, and military matters is not cleanly compartmentalized among those policy spheres. In fact, in a number of instances, Beijing enunciates clear linkages between those spheres. Whether it's regarding Taiwan or other issues, Beijing's policymaking and its statecraft can be seen as unitary across traditional policy categories. US policymakers, in turn, should remind themselves to think about the US approach to cross-strait issues not in a compartmentalized fashion, but as a spectrum of issues that are interconnected. The issue of bolstering Taiwan's international space, as well as the issues of US-Taiwan trade, investment, military sales, and people-to-people ties, directly connect in a unified fashion to the core US interest in cross-strait stability and the prevention of conflict and coercion. Now, this is not a new idea. It's in fact been the underlying concept of US involvement in the Taiwan Strait for the past half century. And it's a concept reflected in the suite of documents that form the basis of the US One China policy, the joint communiques, the Taiwan Relations Act, and the Six Assurances. Those statements take a comprehensive view of US-Taiwan relations. In them, there is no purely political. There is no purely economic. There is no purely security. All aspects of US-Taiwan relations are connected to the overall interest in stability across the strait. Now, that's the basic conceptual framework of US-Taiwan policy. But I'd like to add another concept to that framework. It's a concept we pursued during the Trump administration, and one I believe many in the current Biden administration wish to pursue as well. It's the idea that, paradoxically, the most effective way to maintain stability across the strait is for the United States not to look at Taiwan as a narrow cross-strait issue to be managed. Instead, the United States should widen the aperture. It should look at the example set by Taiwan as an affirmative and positive opportunity to be seized and promoted throughout the Indo-Pacific. Taiwan has a vibrant democratic system. It has made the steady journey from an agrarian economy to one that is capital-intensive, knowledge-based, and cutting-edge. It has enviable positions in terms of higher education, human rights, and social solidarity. Leveraging those qualities to embed Taiwan in the free and open fabric of the Indo-Pacific would go a long way in balancing against Beijing's coercive drive and deterring aggression from across the strait. Beijing, for sure, would like to cut the threads of that fabric around Taiwan. In turn, the United States and our partners need to reinforce those threads, not just for the interests of the people on Taiwan, although those are important. It's for the national interest of the United States across the Indo-Pacific region. Now, this is a conceptual framework that I would propose for U.S. strategy. But what are the specific policies that would animate that framework? There are three tonight that I'd like to highlight, and they pertain to three distinct areas of Taiwan's international space. First, multilateral institutions. Second, China's periodic attempts to poach Taiwan's official diplomatic partners. And third, Taiwan's position in the global trading system. First, in order to protect technical multilateral institutions from Chinese attempts to infuse them with narrow political aims, whether they're focused on Taiwan or not, it's important for the United States to institutionalize within its civil service and its diplomatic corps expertise in multilateral affairs. China has long invested in a concerted effort to whip votes in favor of its countrymen or favored candidates for leadership positions at the UN and UN-related bodies, the WHO among them. This years-long effort has borne political fruit for Beijing, including in the isolation of Taiwan within these bodies. Understanding and then shaping the internal electoral politics of these multilateral bodies is not an intuitive matter. In fact, it's less akin to traditional diplomacy than it is to the peculiar nature of parliamentary politics, involving individual personalities, horse trading among unrelated issues, and flexible and subtle coalition building among repeat players involved in a series of votes over time. In light of this, it's imperative that we adequately equip our career diplomats with the tools and parliamentary tradecraft necessary to successfully win elections for the best candidates. Now, our career diplomats spend normally 2 to 3 years at a time working at multilateral bodies before moving to another more traditional diplomatic post. This structural feature of our foreign service puts them at a disadvantage in learning and executing within these unique political environments. Now, in the Trump administration, there was an important decision to name a special envoy for UN integrity, who was charged with leading the U.S. whip operations in leadership elections, among other duties. But the efforts of the special envoy should be buttressed by further institutionalization of parliamentary skills among our career diplomats. The efforts of our diplomats should be buttressed by more civil servants who have a longer timeline of service at these institutions. Both foreign and civil servants should receive better training in the procedural peculiarities of multilateral bodies, and they should be given more discretion at lower levels to develop, husband, and dispense chits in the furtherance of beneficial deal-making. And an effort should be made to make the multilateral institution career track for diplomats more attractive and more prestigious so that it attracts the best among them. The second policy I would propose relates to counteracting China's periodic attempts to poach Taiwan's official diplomatic partners. In doing this, the United States should take a broad approach that focuses on strengthening Taiwan's international relationships across the board, whether they be official or unofficial. Let me explain more what I mean by that. Whether a relationship is official or unofficial should of course matter to Taipei and the United States, and it does matter. But the official-unofficial distinction, as purely a legal distinction, should matter less to Taipei and the United States in terms of vital interests than it does to Beijing. The Communist Party's narrative, its historical justification, its very legitimacy, is threatened by the official relations that Taiwan possesses. That's why the Communist Party invests so much in invests the poaching of Taiwan's diplomatic partners with such symbolic power. But for the shared Taiwan and US interests in deterring conflict and coercion, in protecting Taiwan's democracy, and in energizing the free and open fabric of the region with Taiwan's example, the best metrics of our success are the number and substantive quality of Taiwan's relationships, regardless of the official or unofficial nomenclature. So in a scenario where China is attempting to poach a Taiwan diplomatic partner, the US should make its views clear with that partner's government. It should, of course, make its views clear with China. And consistently, the US should continue to support joint engagement together with Taiwan, with all of its 15 diplomatic partners, to maintain the value and logic of those relationships. But those efforts should be situated in a wider effort to bolster Taiwan's unofficial relationships, particularly with partners that are larger, wield more strategic weight, and exhibit innate resilience to Chinese pressure. Let's make no mistake, an official relationship with, say, the Vatican matters. But in many ways, US support for unofficial relationships with Southeast Asian states, or with Japan, or with Australia, that are broadened and deepened and that are animated by shared values, matters even more and yields even greater strategic dividends. My third and last proposal is related to my second proposal. An open avenue for the United States to directly buttress Taiwan's international space is in the negotiation of a free trade agreement. As a strategic matter, if the US and Taiwan conclude a free trade agreement, it will further stabilize Taiwan's resiliency to coercion. And it'll also set an example for similar agreements to be concluded around the region with Taiwan. It may also create momentum for Taiwan's accession to other regional trade agreements. Now, I emphasize that a free trade agreement in the abstract makes sense for the United States as a strategic matter. But I'm the first to tell you that a free trade agreement in practice must first make sense for the United States as an economic matter. If it doesn't, the trade agreement will not have popular support, and as a result, it will tend to fray the strategic logic of the agreement over time rather than strengthen it. Finding that economic sweet spot, one that can then give rise to strategic benefits in the long term, is the job of trade negotiators. And I'm eager to see what steps the new US trade representative takes in this regard. Now, I've spoken a long time, and I want to be sure to leave room for some spirited questions and discussion. But I want to say thanks again to you, Karis, and to the Hoover Institution for the opportunity to speak tonight. And I'm looking forward to the conversation.
Okay, great. Thank